Have you ever found yourself staring down a massive real-world research question for your doctoral studies, one that's unfolding right now, with countless moving parts, and you wonder, how on earth do I even begin to tackle this?
Oh, absolutely. It's a universal feeling, I think, for doctoral students.
Yeah.
But honestly, that's also where some of the most fascinating and impactful research really lies.
Yeah.
Getting a handle on those real-time unfolding situations, that's often where the biggest breakthroughs happen, or at least the most interesting insights.
Absolutely. And that's precisely why we're here today. Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed. This is Qualitative Research Unplugged, and this deep dive is our third one, actually. We're building on our previous conversation about digital ethnography.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah. So today, we're zeroing in on a really crucial methodology for so many doctoral journeys: case study research.
And we're lucky because we're drawing our insights from a fantastic resource, a doctoral student's guide to case study research. It's a really practical guide, co-authored by Professor Richard Boateng and Dr. Jonathan Barnor, both from the University of Ghana Business School.
Right.
And this guide, it's specifically tailored to help you, especially if you're a doctoral student there, maybe undertaking the Advanced Qualitative Research Methods course. It's designed to help you conduct relevant, robust, and, importantly, publishable case study research.
Publishable, yes, that's the goal. So our mission today is basically to equip you with a solid understanding of the entire case study process. We're talking everything from the philosophical roots,
Which are so important.
crucial,
Yeah.
to design choices, data collection, analysis, and maybe most importantly, how you ensure the rigor and trustworthiness of your work.
Yeah, we'll try to pull out the most important nuggets, maybe share a few surprising facts, and definitely offer practical insights to help you navigate your own research journey.
Okay, so here's the plan. We'll start by laying the groundwork. What actually is a case study, and what are the philosophical lenses you can look through?
Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty, the design phase, thinking about single versus multiple cases, sampling strategies, all that practical stuff.
Exactly. After that, we'll explore data collection, think interviews, documents, observations, and the ethical side of things, which is huge.
Can't forget ethics,
Never. And then how to rigorously analyze all that data you've collected.
which you feel overwhelming sometimes.
Totally. Finally, we'll talk about reporting your research effectively and making sure it stands up to scrutiny, trustworthiness.
And we'll touch on some real-world examples from the guide, too.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Case study research. It's such a powerful tool for understanding things in their natural context. And we've got these great insights from Professor Boateng and Dr. Barnor to guide us. All right, let's kick things off with the absolute basics. What exactly is a case study in research? Because it's definitely not just, like, telling a story, is it?
No, not at all. That's a common misconception. Think of it less as just a story and more as a deep, focused investigation. The guide defines it as both a research strategy and an empirical inquiry. Basically, you're investigating a contemporary phenomenon, something happening right now, in the present, in depth, and crucially, within its real-world context. It's like, imagine putting a specific living entity under a really powerful microscope, but while it's still operating in its natural habitat, you're not taking it out into a lab.
A microscope in the wild. I like that analogy. And the case itself, you said it's a specific kind of entity, a bounded system. What does that mean, bounded?
It means it has clear borders, clear limits. It's a specific, complex, functioning thing.
Okay.
So the guide gives examples. It could be a single person, a particular group or team within an organization, maybe an entire organization itself, like a company or a school or a nonprofit. Or it could be a community, a specific decision-making process that you want to understand, or even a particular project from start to finish.
So lots of possibilities.
Yes, but the key is that it's a distinct, observable unit that you're focusing on. You're trying to gain a really rich, holistic understanding through intensive, multifaceted analysis. You're pulling together different pieces of evidence to understand why or how something is happening within that bounded system.
How and why questions, you flagged that earlier, and it seems really important. That contrasts pretty sharply with, say, experimental methods where you're controlling variables, right?
Exactly. Or with large-scale surveys where you're looking for broad statistical trends across a population. Case studies are ideal when you want to understand the dynamics within a specific setting, especially for contemporary events where you, as the researcher, have very little or no control over what's actually happening.
Right, you're observing, not manipulating.
Precisely. You're not looking for statistical generalization to a huge population in quite the same way. The goal is more about analytical insights, understanding the complexity of a situation.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, a really critical part of any research, especially at the doctoral level, and this is key for you folks in the Advanced Qualitative Research Methods course at UGBS, is understanding your philosophical compass, your philosophical stance. Why does this matter so much? It sounds a bit abstract.
Yeah, it might sound abstract, but it's actually the most practical decision you make, your philosophical stance or paradigm. It's really about your fundamental belief about reality itself.
Like, what is real?
Exactly. Is reality out there objective, just waiting for us to discover it? Or is it something that we, collectively build and interpret through our experiences and social interactions? Your answer to that fundamental question shapes every single decision you make in your research. It dictates what kinds of questions you even think are worth asking, how you go about collecting and analyzing your data, and ultimately what you consider to be valid or trustworthy findings. It's the foundation everything else is built on.
So it's not just an academic exercise. It actually directs the research. Let's unpack these different approaches then. First up, the positivist case study. What's the core belief there about reality?
Okay, the positivist approach starts from the assumption that there is an objective reality out there, independent of our perception of it. It exists whether we study it or not.
Like laws of nature?
Sort of, yeah. The goal for a positivist researcher is typically to test existing theories, identify clear cause and effect relationships, and ultimately discover general principles or laws that can be replicated by others.
Okay.
So the research design tends to be highly structured. You try to minimize researcher bias as much as possible, often using predefined constructs or variables that you measure. It's about objectivity and replicability.
Right. So let's take that fictional example from the guide, Innovate Tech, with its high employee turnover. If a positivist researcher was looking at that, what would they be trying to find?
They'd be looking for that hard, quantifiable link, a direct cause and effect. Their research question might be something like, to what extent do salary levels below the industry, average and average weekly hours exceeding 50 NS guys, causally impact the rate of employee turnover at Innovate Tech? Very specific.
Okay, very measurable.
Exactly. They define measurable constructs. Turnover rate, salary competitiveness, working hours.
Yeah.
They'd collect quantitative data, payroll records, time tracking logs, maybe exit survey data with ratings. Then they'd use statistical methods, maybe regression analysis, to see if there's a statistically significant relationship.
And the outcome they're looking for?
A statistical conclusion. Something like a 10% decrease in salary competitiveness is associated with a 15% increase in quarterly employee turnover, holding other factors constant. Yeah. It's all about finding those measurable, hopefully generalizable cause and effect patterns.
Okay, got it. Now let's flip the coin completely, the interpretive case study. This sounds like it lives in a totally different universe.
It kind of does. The interpretive approach is rooted in the belief that reality is subjective, it's socially constructed. There isn't one single true reality out there, but multiple realities shaped by people's experiences and interpretations.
Wow, okay.
So the goal here isn't to find objective truth in the positivist sense. It's to understand phenomena by accessing the meanings that participants themselves assign to their experiences and actions.
So less about what happened and more about what did it mean to the people involved.
Precisely. And here, the researcher's own subjectivity isn't seen as a contaminant to be eliminated, but as an acknowledged part of the process. The focus shifts to providing what Clifford Geertz called thick description, a rich, deep, nuanced understanding of the lived experience within that specific case.
So back to Innovate Tech and its turnover problem. An interpretive researcher wouldn't be crunching numbers from payroll.
Probably not their primary focus. They'd be more interested in the stories behind the numbers. Their goal would be to understand the lived experiences of the employees who left and the meanings they attribute to their decision to leave.
So the question changes.
Completely. It might be something like, how do former software developers at Innovate Tech describe and make sense of their decision to leave the company?
And the methods.
You'd rely heavily on things like in-depth, open-ended interviews, really getting people to share their stories, their feelings, their interpretations. You might analyze emails or reflective journals if available. The analysis would likely be thematic, looking for recurring patterns of meaning in what people say.
And the outcome wouldn't be a statistic.
No, the outcome would be that thick description. You might identify key themes like, say, a pervasive culture of psychological pressure, or a feeling of alienation, or a search for work-life balance. The conclusion might sound something like, for many former employees, the decision to leave Innovatech was framed not just as a career move, but as an act of reclaiming personal identity and well-being. Turnover, in this context, was understood as an emotional and even existential response to the work environment. It's about the depth and texture of human experience.
That's a very different kind of understanding. Okay, now there's a third way mentioned in the guide, the critical realist case study. It's positioned as a sort of bridge between positivism and interpretivism. How does that work? How can it bridge those seemingly opposite views?
Critical realism is fascinating, and yet it tries to find a middle ground. It agrees with positivism that there is a real world out there that exists independently of our minds. Structures are real.
Okay, so reality exists.
Yes. But it agrees with interpretivism that our understanding of that reality is always filtered through our interpretations, our concepts, our social locations. We can't access reality directly or perfectly.
So it acknowledges both objective reality and subjective understanding.
Exactly. And its unique goal is to explain phenomena by identifying the underlying, often unobservable structures and causal mechanisms that generate the observable events we see. It asks why, but digs deeper than just surface correlations or subjective feelings. It pushes you to ask what hidden forces or systems are actually producing what we observe.
So it's trying to get at the root causes, the hidden machinery.
That's a great way to put it. The hidden machinery. It wants to understand why things happen by looking at those deeper structures. This is often where the most transformative insights in research lie, especially for complex social problems.
So applying this to Innovatech, a critical realist wouldn't just look at salary numbers or employee feelings, they'd look deeper.
Correct. Their research goal might be to explain why Innovatech has this high-pressure culture by identifying the underlying, perhaps hidden, structures that cause it. The research question could be something like, what are the underlying causal mechanisms that generate both the high-pressure work culture and the high rate of employee turnover at Innovatech?
And how would they investigate that?
They'd likely combine methods. They might do interviews like the interpretivist to understand experiences, but they'd also likely dig into archival data, maybe company reports, investor relations documents, industry analyses, historical accounts of the company's founding and funding. They're looking for clues about those deeper structures.
Like the economic model, maybe?
Precisely. The aim is an explanatory model that shows how these deeper structures generate the observable realities. So a critical realist conclusion for Innovatech might argue something like this. High employee turnover at Innovatech isn't just about salaries or bad managers. It's a predictable outcome generated by the deep-seated structural pressures of its venture capital-driven business model. This model demands aggressive, short-term growth above all else, which inevitably creates the observable culture of pressure as a manifestation of that underlying economic reality.
Wow, that connects the dots in a really powerful way, going beyond the symptoms. Okay, so understanding your philosophical stance is clearly step one. Now let's look at the different types of case studies. The guide mentions a few ways to categorize them. First, based on purpose, using Yin's categories: exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory.
Right. These categories basically help you clarify what you're trying to achieve with your study.
Oh.
So an exploratory case study. You use this when you know very little about a topic or a phenomenon. Maybe it's new, maybe there are no clear outcomes yet.
Like dipping your toe in the water.
Exactly. It's often a preliminary step, maybe leading to a larger, more focused study later. The goal is to explore the situation, identify key variables, generate initial hypotheses, or develop questions for subsequent research.
Can we use the Adepasopes example from the guide's appendix here? How would an exploratory study look?
Sure. For Adepasopes' initial response to COVID-19, an exploratory study, like an Appendix A, would aim to understand how the leadership perceived and navigated the initial chaos and uncertainty. You wouldn't go in with a strong theory. You'd use open-ended interviews, maybe observe early team meetings, just trying to uncover emergent themes like maybe supply chain agility or employee fear management without knowing exactly what you'll find. It's about understanding the lived experience of navigating that initial chaos.
Okay, then we have descriptive case studies.
Right. A descriptive case study aims to provide a rich, detailed narrative or profile of a phenomenon within its real-world context. Unlike exploratory, it usually starts with some kind of guiding descriptive theory or framework that tells you what aspects to focus on.
Now, it's more focused than exploratory.
Yes. For adiposomes, like in Appendix B, a descriptive study would aim to systematically document what specific crisis management strategies they actually implemented across different parts of the business operations. HR, marketing during, say, the first year of the pandemic.
What did they do?
Exactly. It provides a detailed chronological account. You might document the new hygiene protocols they introduced, the shift to social media sales, the timeline of events. The outcome is a comprehensive, factual picture of what happened.
And finally, explanatory case studies. This sounds like where we get back to the why questions, but maybe with a more causal focus.
Precisely. Explanatory studies are designed for causal investigations. They seek to explain how or why a particular phenomenon occurred. The goal is often to build or test theoretical explanations for the observed outcomes.
So, for adiposomes, what would an explanatory question be?
An explanatory study, like Appendix C, might ask, why was Adiposomes able to increase its revenue by 50% in 2020 when many of its local competitors struggled or even closed? See, it's explicitly seeking an explanation.
Right, it's asking for the reason behind the success.
Yes, it goes beyond just describing what they did to building a causal argument. It tries to link specific actions like their adaptive marketing pivot or their leadership style to the successful outcome. The result is often an explanatory model that pinpoints the key factors or mechanisms responsible for the success. For example, Adiposomes' growth can be explained by the causal link between its leader's adaptive style and the company's ability to pivot rapidly. This adaptive capacity was the primary mechanism. It's building a causal story.
That's really clear. Now, besides purpose, the guide also mentions another typology from Stake, Guba, and Lincoln: intrinsic, instrumental, and collective cases. How do these differ?
These categories focus more on the reason you chose the case and its relationship to your broader research goals. An intrinsic case study is when the case itself is the primary focus of interest. Maybe it's unique, extremely significant, or historically important. Your goal is to understand that specific case in all its depth and particularity, not necessarily to generalize from it.
So the case is the main point.
Yes. In contrast, an instrumental case study is where the case is chosen because it serves as a means to an end. It's a vehicle, an instrument, to help you gain insight into a wider issue, phenomenon, or theoretical question. The specific case is secondary. It's what the case helps you understand about something broader that matters most.
Okay, so the case helps illustrate a larger point.
Exactly. And then a collective case study, which is sometimes called a multiple case study, involves studying several instrumental cases together. You select multiple cases purposefully to allow for comparison and to gain an even deeper, more robust understanding of the general phenomenon, population, or condition you're interested in. It strengthens the findings by looking across different contexts.
Okay, so you've wrestled with your philosophical stance. You've decided on the type of case study: exploratory, descriptive, maybe explanatory, single or multiple. Now comes the really practical part: designing the study itself. This feels like where the rubber meets the road, and honestly, where a lot of doctoral journeys, especially for those of you tackling the Advanced Qualitative Research Methods course at UGBS, can hit a major hurdle. How do you build that rock-solid foundation?
You're absolutely right. Design is critical. It's not just a formality. It's the logical foundation of your entire inquiry. A well-documented and justified design ensures your research is focused, feasible, and ultimately capable of rigorously answering your research questions. And it's often an iterative process. It evolves as your understanding deepens.
So what are the key steps involved in actually designing a case study, according to the guide? Let's start with step 1. Define and refine the research question.
This is ground zero. You have to start with a clear research question. And remember Yen's point. Case studies are particularly good for those how and why questions about contemporary events you can't control.
Right.
Now, your initial question might be quite broad. Like our earlier example, why is employee turnover so high at Innovate Tech? That's a fine starting point.
But it probably needs tightening up.
Almost certainly. In qualitative research, especially case studies, your questions often evolve. As you dive into the literature, maybe talk to a few people or do a small pilot study, you'll start to refine it. It needs to become more specific and, importantly, researchable. So that broad question might become, how do specific managerial practices related to project deadlines and feedback mechanisms at InnovateTech contribute to the software developer's experience of burnout and their subsequent decision to leave?
Much sharper.
Exactly. That refinement is crucial. It prevents you from drowning in data later and ensures your study has a manageable scope, which is vital for completing a doctorate on time.
Okay, step 2. Conduct a comprehensive literature review. We know it's important, but how does it function as a design tool specifically?
Great question. It's much more than just chapter 2 of your thesis. First, it helps you identify the knowns and unknowns in your field. Where are the gaps? This allows you to clearly articulate your study's unique contribution. Why does this research need to be done?
Finding your niche?
Precisely. Second, the literature review helps you develop your theoretical framework. This isn't just a summary of theories, it's what Walsham called a theoretical scaffold. It provides a lens, informs your underlying assumptions, and guides how you'll interpret your findings.
And it helps identify things to look for initially.
Yes, that's Eisenhardt's idea of identifying a priori constructs. Based on previous research, you might identify potential concepts relevant to your topic, like maybe organizational justice or role ambiguity, if you're studying turnover. These give you a tentative starting point for developing interview questions or observation checklists. But, and this is important, you have to be prepared to discard these if your actual data tells you they aren't relevant in your specific case. Don't force the data to fit the theory.
Good point. Okay, step 3. Determine the unit of analysis and boundaries of the case. The guide calls this one of the most challenging decisions. Why?
Because it defines exactly what you are studying. The unit of analysis is the thing your research question is primarily about. Is it an individual person, a specific team, the entire organization, a particular decision-making process? You have to be crystal clear.
Can you give an example?
Sure. If your research question is about how a cross-functional team developed a new product, then your unit of analysis is the team, not the individual engineers or marketers on it, although you'll likely collect data from them.
What about those embedded units you mentioned earlier?
Right. Sometimes a case study can have multiple units of analysis within the main case. For example, your main case might be a hospital, but you might also analyze specific wards or departments as embedded subunits. This allows for comparison within the main case, but it does require a more complex design and analysis plan, looking at findings at different levels.
And besides defining the unit, you also have to bound the case.
Yes, bounding is crucial for scope. You need to set clear limits. Temporal boundaries. When does the case start and end? Example, from the project initiation to its termination. Conceptual boundaries. What specific aspects or processes are included and what's explicitly excluded. Contextual boundaries. What aspects of the environment are relevant? Defining these boundaries prevents your study from becoming endlessly scrolling.
Keeps it manageable. Okay, step 4 is developing the case study protocol. This sounds very formal, like a recipe.
It kind of is. Think of it as your detailed research plan or blueprint. It's a formal document outlining exactly how you intend to conduct the study. Yen really emphasizes its importance for ensuring reliability and rigor, especially if you're doing a multiple case study where consistency across cases is vital.
What goes into this protocol?
Key things include an overview of your study's objectives and research questions, detailed field procedures, how will you gain access, who are your key contacts, how will you handle unexpected events. It should also include the high-level case study questions that will guide your inquiry in the field, and maybe even a tentative outline or structure for your final report. It's your operational guide.
Makes sense. And step 5, plan the pilot case. You mentioned this earlier. Why is it so highly recommended?
Because it's your chance to do a dress rehearsal on a smaller scale, usually with a case that's easier to access. The benefits are huge. You can refine your overall research plan and your protocol based on real-world experience. You get to test your instruments. Is your interview guide clear? Are your observation checklists practical?
Find the kinks.
Exactly. It helps you sharpen the focus of your main study questions, maybe revealing angles you hadn't considered. And you often gain crucial practical insights like how long interviews actually take or potential access issues before you invest heavily in your main cases. It can save you an enormous amount of time and potential frustration later on. Seriously, do a pilot if you possibly can.
Sound advice. Now let's talk about structure. There's a fundamental difference in how you structure a single case study versus a multiple case study, right? Especially in the logic and analysis.
Absolutely. They operate on different logics. For a single case study, the whole point is depth. You're doing a deep, holistic, intensive analysis of one specific bounded system. The design logic is to provide a complete, rich, in-depth picture of that particular case.
So you need a strong reason for picking just one.
Yes, your justification for selecting that single case. Maybe it's a unique case, a critical test of a theory, a revelatory case must be really strong and clearly articulated. The analysis is primarily within case analysis. You organize the large volume of data from multiple sources to tell that one case's story, perhaps chronologically or thematically.
And the dissertation structure might reflect that.
Often, yes. The findings chapters might present a rich narrative account of the case, maybe one chapter setting the context, and then subsequent chapters dissecting different themes or aspects within that single context.
Okay, now contrast that with a multiple case study. The logic here is different. It's about replication, not sampling.
Precisely. This is a crucial distinction, especially for doctoral students in courses like Advanced Qualitative Research Methods, where you need to justify your approach. You're not selecting multiple cases to get a statistically representative sample of the population. Instead, you're following a replication logic, as Yin describes it.
Your replication logic.
Yeah. Each case is treated almost like a separate experiment or study. You purposefully select cases that you predict will either yield similar results, literal replication confirming your emerging findings, or contrasting results for predictable theoretical reasons. Theoretical replication helping you refine or expand your theory by explaining the differences.
So the selection is very strategic.
Extremely strategic, driven by your developing theory. And the analysis reflects this. It's typically a two-stage process.
Okay, what are the two stages?
First, you still do within-case analysis for each individual case. You need to understand the unique details and story of each case on its own terms first.
Like mini single case studies first.
Kind of, yes. But then comes the second crucial stage for theory building, cross-case analysis. This is where you systematically compare and contrast the findings across all your cases. You're actively searching for patterns, themes, similarities, and differences. What holds true across all cases? Where do they diverge, and why? This comparison is what allows you to build a more robust, generalizable, in the analytical sense, theory.
And how does this affect the final report or dissertation structure?
Findings chapters in a multiple case study are usually structured thematically, not case by case. So for each major theme or proposition emerging from your analysis, you present the evidence from all the relevant cases, highlighting how different cases support the theme, perhaps showing nuances or contrasting evidence. This cross-case comparison makes for a much stronger theoretical argument than just presenting separate case stories.
Got it. That makes the purpose of multiple cases much clearer. Now, let's quickly touch on sampling techniques. You said it's purposive, not statistical. Can you give examples of common purposive sampling strategies used in case study research?
Sure. The core idea is selecting information-rich cases, cases that offer the most insight into your research question. One common technique, especially in grounded theory, is theoretical sampling.
How does that work?
You select cases sequentially, one after another. Your analysis of the first case helps you decide which case to select next. You choose the case that seems most likely to help you elaborate on your emerging theory. You continue this process until you reach theoretical saturation, which basically means collecting data from new cases isn't adding any significant new insights or dimensions to your theory.
So it's driven by the emerging analysis. What about maximum variation sampling?
Here, you deliberately select cases that are very different from each other on key characteristics relevant to your study. The idea is that if you find common patterns or themes that cut across these very diverse cases, those findings might have broader significance or applicability.
Can you give an example?
Let's say you're studying youth entrepreneurship programs in West Africa. Using maximum variation, you might select a case involving a tech startup incubator in a major city like Accra, another case involving a rural agricultural cooperative, and maybe a third case involving informal cross-border traders. If you find, for instance, that participation in the program significantly increased the economic agency of young women across all these vastly different settings, that's a powerful finding.
Because it holds true despite the differences.
Exactly. Then there's homogeneous sampling, which is the opposite. You select cases that are very similar to study a particular subgroup in depth, or critical case sampling, where you select a case that represents a crucial test of a theory. The logic is, if it happens or doesn't happen here, it will likely happen anywhere.
Like a litmus test case.
Precisely. You also have extreme or deviant case sampling, focusing on outliers, unusual successes, or notable failures to learn from unique circumstances. And sometimes snowball or chain sampling is used, where initial participants recommend others, which is useful for accessing hard-to-reach populations. The key is that the choice of sampling strategy must align logically with your research question and the type of understanding you're trying to achieve.
Okay, we've navigated the philosophical choices and the complexities of design and sampling. Now we're ready for part 3, actually collecting the data and navigating the ethical landscape. Step 6 in the guide is data collection in the main study. What are the key principles here?
The guide emphasizes that this phase needs to be systematic following your protocol, but also flexible enough to adapt to what you're finding in the field. And the absolute cornerstone, the guiding principle, is triangulation.
We keep coming back to triangulation.
Because it's that important for rigor. A core strength of case study research is its ability to draw on multiple sources of evidence. Relying on just one source, that's considered a major weakness, almost a fatal flaw in a case study.
Makes sense. So what are these multiple sources typically?
There's a range. Interviews are often central. They give you direct access to people's perspectives, their experiences, their interpretations. Semi-structured interviews where you have a guide but can deviate are very common.
Talking to people.
Yes. Then documents. These can be incredibly valuable. Internal documents like meeting minutes, emails, internal reports, strategy memos, and external documents like news articles, competitor analyses, public reports. Documents provide stable, unobtrusive data. They can corroborate what people tell you in interviews or sometimes challenge it, which is also insightful. Observation. Actually watching what happens. This can be direct observation, where you're more of a neutral bystander, or participant observation, where you take on a more active role within the setting. Observation gives you direct access to the context, to people's actual behaviors, not just what they say they do, and to social dynamics.
Seeing it for yourself.
Exactly.
Right.
Increasingly important today are audio-visual materials. Things like photographs, videos, recordings of events, even relevant social media posts or website content. These can be powerful sources for capturing visual context, analyzing interactions, or understanding public communication and sentiment. The key is using a combination of these sources.
Which brings us back again to the principle of triangulation. Define it for us one more time and explain why it's so critical for credibility.
Okay. Simply put, triangulation is the practice of using multiple sources or methods to cross-check and corroborate your findings. If you find evidence for the same fact or phenomenon through an interview, and you see it mentioned in a document, and you observe it happening, then your confidence in that finding goes way up.
It's like building a stronger case in court with multiple witnesses and different types of evidence.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
It significantly enhances the credibility and trustworthiness of your research. And there are different types, as the guide mentions.
Right, like data triangulation.
Yes, data triangulation is using different data sources, like we just discussed. Interview plus document plus observation. Investigator triangulation involves having multiple researchers collect or analyze data independently, which helps reduce individual researcher bias. Methodological triangulation means using multiple methods within the study, maybe combining your qualitative case study with a small quantitative survey administered within the case organization. Using triangulation rigorously is probably the single most important way to strengthen your case study's claims.
Got it. Triangulate, triangulate, triangulate.
Yeah.
Now, for interviews, which you said are often central, having a good interview guide is crucial. How do you develop one that is focused enough to get the data you need, but flexible enough for a natural conversation?
It's a balancing act. A good guide keeps the interview on track, but doesn't stifle emergent insights. The first step is to identify the key themes or topics you need to cover, based on your research questions and your theoretical framework.
To link it back to the design.
Always. Second, draft open-ended questions for each theme. Critically, avoid leading questions or questions that can be answered with a simple yes or no, instead of, was the project management poor? And ask, can you walk me through how key decisions were made during the project? See the difference?
Yeah, one invites a story, the other invites a judgment.
Exactly. Third, include probes. These are essential follow-up questions you can use to get more detail or clarification. Things like, could you tell me more about that? Wait, can you give me a specific example? How did that make you feel? What happened next? What was the consequence of that? Probes are your tools for digging deeper.
And structure.
Structure the guide logically. Usually an introduction, explaining the purpose, confidentiality, getting consent, maybe some easy warm-up questions, then the main thematic questions, and finally conclusion, where you thank them and ask if they have any questions for you.
And the final step.
Pilot test it. Always. Always pilot test your interview guide. Talk to someone similar to your intended participants. This will immediately reveal any questions that are confusing, awkwardly phrased, or maybe too sensitive. It also helps you estimate how long the interview will take. Piloting saves you so much trouble down the road.
Makes sense. Now, we're living in a digital world. How do we incorporate data from social media, videos, online forums, etc., into case study research? What kind of data is this?
Yeah, this is increasingly relevant. This digital data can include discussions on platforms like LinkedIn, Twitter, Reddit, comments on news articles or blogs, YouTube videos, organizational websites, even photos shared online. Essentially, you often treat this data as a text analog, like a transcript, or as a digital artifact.
And how do you analyze it?
You can apply similar analytical techniques as you would to interviews or documents. Thematic analysis or content analysis can be used to identify recurring themes, arguments, sentiment, or communication patterns. For videos or photos, you might analyze them for visual cues about context, social interactions, the use of space, or technology.
But the ethics seem particularly tricky here, right? Publish versus private online.
Huge challenge. This is probably the biggest hurdle with digital data. Just because something is publicly accessible online doesn't automatically mean the creator intended or consented for it to be used in research. The lines are very blurry.
So what's the best practice for doctoral students?
The guide suggests, and ethical best practice generally dictates. First, try to seek consent if it's feasible, especially if you're focusing on specific individuals. If that's not possible, you must thoroughly anonymize the data, remove usernames, profile pictures, any potentially identifying details from quotes. Be extremely sensitive to the norms and expectations of the specific online community you're studying.
Okay. Anonymize rigorously.
Yes. Also, critically evaluate the authenticity and context of the data. Who posted it? Why? What was the surrounding conversation? Avoid taking things out of context. And finally, use digital data as part of your triangulation strategy. Don't rely on it solely. Use it to corroborate, challenge, or provide a different angle on findings from your interviews, documents, or observations. It adds another layer, but handle it with care.
That's really helpful advice. And speaking of ethics more broadly, beyond just digital data, case studies often involve getting quite close to people's lives and organizations. What are the absolute paramount ethical principles researchers must adhere to?
Ethics has to be front and center throughout the entire research process. The guide highlights several key principles essential for anyone doing research, especially doctoral candidates at UGBS. First and foremost is informed consent.
The foundation.
Absolutely. Participants must voluntarily agree to take part after they've been fully informed about the study's purpose, what participation involves, any potential risks or benefits, how their data will be used, and that they can withdraw at any time without penalty. And crucially, consent isn't just a form you sign at the beginning. It's an ongoing process of communication.
Okay. What else?
Confidentiality and anonymity. You have a duty to protect the identities of your participants and the organizations they belong to, if requested or necessary. This usually means using pseudonyms for people and places in your notes and final report. Be especially careful in small or unique settings where even contextual details might inadvertently identify someone. And, of course, securely store all your data to prevent breaches.
Keep the data safe.
Definitely. Third is the principle of avoiding harm, often summarized as do no harm. This includes potential psychological distress. Don't ask questions insensitively. Be mindful of trauma. It also includes social harm. Could your research damage someone's reputation, career prospects, or relationships? You need to anticipate and mitigate these risks.
Thinking through consequences.
Yes. And finally, transparency and honesty. Be clear and truthful about who you are, your role as a researcher, and the purpose of your study. Never use deception to gain access or elicit information. Maintaining integrity and building trust with your participants is fundamental to ethical case study research.
All right, we've collected our data from multiple sources, navigated the ethics. Now comes what the guide calls possibly the most challenging yet also the most creative part. Part 4, data analysis, step 7. It's iterative, often overlapping with data collection. Where do we even start with a mountain of qualitative data?
It can definitely feel like a mountain, but yes, it's iterative. You don't wait until all data is collected to start thinking about it. And a really foundational method for making sense of qualitative data, as mentioned in the guide, is thematic analysis. The 6-phase approach developed by Virginia Braun and Victoria Clark is probably the most widely cited and used framework.
Okay, thematic analysis. Can you give us the gist of those 6 phases? What's the core idea of each step, especially for our listeners navigating this for their doctorate?
Absolutely. Let's break it down. Phase 1 is familiarizing yourself with your data. This is crucial. It means deep immersion. You need to transcribe your interviews, if you recorded them, read and reread everything, transcripts, field notes, documents you collected, listen back to audio recordings. The goal here is just to get intimately familiar with the breadth and depth of your data, making initial notes and jotting down early ideas. Don't rush this phase.
So live with the data for a bit.
Exactly. Phase 2 is generating initial codes. Once you're familiar, you start systematically working through your data. labeling segments of text that seem interesting or relevant to your research question. A code is just a short descriptive label for a piece of data, like communication breakdown or adapting to remote work. You can do this manually with highlighters and margins or using qualitative data analysis software like NVivo. This step helps you organize the data into meaningful groups.
Breaking it down into smaller pieces.
Yes. Then, phase 3 is searching for themes. This is where you start moving from those specific codes to broader patterns of meaning. You look at your codes and the data associated with them, and you start collating related codes into potential themes. A theme captures something important about the data in relation to your research question. You might use visual methods here, like mind maps, to see connections.
Seeing the bigger picture emerge from the codes?
Precisely. Phase 4 is reviewing potential themes. This is a refinement step. You review the themes you've generated against two things. First, do the collated data extracts for each theme form a coherent pattern? And second, does the overall set of themes accurately reflect the meaning evident in the entire data set? You might need to refine themes, merge some together, split others, or discard ones that don't have enough data or aren't distinct.
Testing and tuning the themes.
Right. Phase 5 is defining and naming themes. Once you have your refined set of themes, you need to write a detailed analysis for each one. Define exactly what the theme is about, what's interesting about it, and how it helps answer your research question. You also create a concise, informative, and compelling name for each theme. This detailed write-up essentially forms the core of your findings chapter.
Giving them clear identities.
Yes. And finally, phase 6 is producing the report. This involves weaving together your analytic narrative, your explanations and interpretations of the themes, with vivid, compelling data extracts, direct quotes from interviews, specific examples from documents or observations that support your interpretations. The goal is to write a scholarly, convincing account that tells the story of your data, directly addresses your research questions, and connects your findings back to the broader literature. That's the essence of the Braun and Clark approach.
That's a really helpful overview of a systematic process. Now, for multiple case studies, the analysis gets another layer. Within case and cross-case analysis, the guide uses that hypothetical study of leadership styles in 6 companies to illustrate this. How does that two-stage process actually work in practice?
This is absolutely fundamental for building robust theory from multiple cases, something doctoral students really need to master if they take this route. Within case analysis always comes first. Before you even think about comparing the companies, you need to become an expert on each one individually.
So you treat each case like a mini-study first.
Exactly. You write a detailed narrative or analysis for each company separately. You explore its unique history, its specific context, the dynamics at play within that single case, using all the data you collected for that case. You try, as much as possible, not to be influenced by what you're seeing in the other cases at this stage.
Can you illustrate with the example, say, beta innovations?
Sure. For beta innovations, you'd focus only on beta. You'd synthesize all the data interviews with their CEO and developers, notes from observing their meetings, R&D documents, etc. Then you'd write a rich, descriptive story about beta. Maybe something like, at Beta Innovations, CEO Jane Doe has deliberately cultivated a culture centered on a powerful, shared vision for changing the industry. This transformational leadership approach appears to foster high levels of intrinsic motivation and engagement among developers. However, this empowerment isn't without its challenges. Interview data reveals that the lack of formal roles and processes sometimes leads to conflict over project direction. You get the idea. A detailed portrait.
Yeah, deep dive into just beta.
And you'd repeat that process meticulously for alpha A&T, gamma casting, delta packaging, epsilon robotics, and zeta fabrics, resulting in 6 distinct standalone case narratives or summaries. This deep understanding of each individual case is the essential foundation for the next step.
Which is the cross-case analysis. This is where the theory building really happens, right? Looking across those 6 stories.
Precisely. This is the second and arguably the most crucial step for developing robust, generalizable theoretical propositions from multiple cases. You systematically compare the cases, actively searching for similarities and differences that can help you build and refine your theory. The summary table shown in the guide is a classic tool for this, laying out key variables or themes across all cases.
How would you use that table with the leadership examples?
Well, you'd start searching for patterns. For example, you might compare beta innovations, which you found had a transformational style, with gamma casting, which you described as autocratic. Comparing their outcomes, maybe high innovation at beta, low morale at gamma, could lead you to generate an initial proposition, like Leadership styles providing vision and empowerment like transformational seem to be associated with higher employee innovation and engagement, whereas styles that centralize control, like autocratic, appear linked to lower morale and resistance to change.
Okay, so you form a tentative idea based on comparing two cases.
Yes. Then you use the other cases to test and refine that idea. Remember the replication logic. You'd look at Epsilon Robotics, maybe coded as democratic. Does it support the empowerment leads to engagement? Part of your proposition. Perhaps.
What if a case doesn't fit neatly?
That's where refinement happens. Maybe alpha A&T, coded transactional, shows high efficiency on routine tasks, but not particularly high engagement or innovation. This might lead you to refine your initial proposition. Maybe the effectiveness of a leadership style is contingent on the primary organizational goal. For example, innovation versus efficiency.
Adding nuance.
Exactly. You also use the framework to understand the more complex cases, like delta packaging. Laissez-faire may be showing empowerment without clear direction is ineffective. Or Zeta fabrics. Situational, perhaps suggesting successful leaders adapt their approach based on context. By systematically moving from those detailed within case stories to this structured cross-case comparison, looking for patterns and explaining variations, you build a much more sophisticated, nuanced, and strongly evidence-based theory than you could ever get from just one case. It's a powerful analytical strategy.
That brings us neatly to part 5, reporting your findings and ensuring the rigor of your work. Step 8 is compose the report. The guide emphasizes this isn't just about presenting data. The report is the argument. How do you craft that convincing narrative?
That's exactly right. The final report is where you construct your argument, weaving together your theoretical framework, your evidence, and your interpretation into a coherent and persuasive whole. Transparency about your evidence and your analytical logic is key.
And the guide talks about crafting a rich and holistic narrative. What does that mean in practice?
Richness comes from using vivid, detailed evidence. Don't just summarize. Show the reader. Use direct quotes from interviews, provide specific details from documents you analyzed, include illustrative vignettes or examples from your observations. This allows the reader to almost enter the case themselves and see the basis for your interpretations. It makes the research come alive.
So show, don't just tell.
Precisely. Holism means describing the case as a whole system, including its context, and showing how the different parts or themes you identified are interconnected. Avoid presenting your findings as just a disconnected list of themes. You need to weave them together into a coherent story that explains the dynamics of the case or the patterns across cases.
And for multiple case studies, you mentioned structuring the report thematically is often better?
Yes. Generally, a thematic structure works better for the findings chapters of a multiple case study. Instead of writing a separate chapter for each case, you organize chapters around your key themes or propositions. Within each thematic chapter, you present the supporting and contrasting evidence from across all your relevant cases. This structure inherently emphasizes the cross-case analysis and builds a stronger theoretical argument than a simple case-by-case presentation.
Okay. Now, the guide introduces a really practical tool, the structured case study format. What's the purpose of this specific format, particularly thinking about our doctoral student audience at UGBS?
This format is designed to provide a clear, logical, and analytical framework for organizing and presenting case study research, especially helpful for exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory studies. For doctoral students, it's incredibly useful because it helps ensure clarity, coherence, and completeness in their write-up.
How does it help?
It guides the student and the reader systematically through. First, the organizational context. Second, how the phenomenon under study emerged. Third, the core events, processes, and issues of the case itself. And finally, the implications and future outlook. It really helps students move beyond just unstructured storytelling and encourages a much more analytical, evidence-based approach that integrates data and theory effectively. It aligns well with what examiners and journals expect in terms of rigor and structure.
Can we quickly walk through the main sections of this format, maybe using the Adepasopes example again to make it concrete?
Sure. It typically starts with 1, case context. This section introduces the setting and the subject, the case. It orients the reader and describes the organization before the main phenomenon occurred, providing a baseline. For Adepasopes, this section will detail its profile. A small artisanal soap-making business in Aburi, Ghana, founded in 2015 by Ama, a biochemist, with 5 staff specializing in natural soaps, primarily selling to tourists and boutique hotels pre-2020.
Sets the stage.
Exactly. Then comes 2, background to phenomenon. This part lays out the conditions and events that led up to the phenomenon you're studying. It answers, how did this situation come about? For Adipa soaps, it would describe the precursor conditions, like inconsistent tourist traffic, competitive pressures pre-pandemic, the first instance or trigger, the March 2020 border closures and lockdowns in Ghana, and the initial perspectives of the actors. Ama and her team feeling fear, uncertainty, expecting closure, having zero sales.
Got it. Then the main part.
Yes. 3. Case phenomena. This is the core analytical section where you describe and explain the phenomenon itself. This is where your evidence, analysis, and narrative really come together. For Adipa soaps, the guide titles this crisis as a catalyst for change. You state the main issues or themes that emerged, like the rapid digital pivot, supply chain resilience built on personal relationships, adaptive marketing using public health messaging.
So you present the themes here.
Yes, and you explore the concepts, processes, and impacts. How did Adipa respond? What strategies did they use? You describe the key events chronologically, like Ama's niece setting up Instagram WhatsApp, the launch of the Adipa's Shield social media campaign that went viral, the surge in demand from local organizations.
And you include evidence.
Critically important here. You'd include direct quotes from respondents, like MA saying, "Forget what we used to do. From now on, our market is every single person in Accra with a phone." You also discuss constraints and challenges like logistical hurdles with deliveries, supply issues overcome through personal ties, and detail the outcomes and impact. The dramatic shift to 95% local customers, sales surpassing previous peaks, the transformation into a resilient digital brand.
Wow, that really covers the core story.
It does. And finally, 4, future outlook. This section reflects on what the case means moving forward for the organization, maybe for the sector, or for future research. For Adipa soaps, it mentions Ama's plan to keep the digital channel primary, her reflection that the pandemic forced them to find a new market, and her future plans for e-commerce partnerships. This structured format really ensures you cover all the bases analytically.
That seems like an incredibly useful template for students structuring their write-up. Okay, last crucial step, step 9, ensure validity and reliability, or as it's more commonly termed in qualitative research, trustworthiness. How do we demonstrate rigor when we're not using statistics?
Great question. Qualitative research isn't judged by the same quantitative metrics of validity and reliability, but it has its own parallel concepts focused on establishing the trustworthiness of the findings. The guide outlines 4 key criteria based on the work of Lincoln and Guba.
What's the first one?
Credibility. This is roughly analogous to internal validity in quantitative research. It asks, how confident are we in the truth of the findings? Do they accurately capture the phenomenon studied?
And how do you achieve credibility?
Key techniques include prolonged engagement in the field, spending enough time to really understand the context, persistent observation, focusing in depth on relevant aspects, and, most importantly, that recurring theme. Triangulation of data sources, methods, or investigators. Corroborating findings through multiple lenses is the strongest way to boost credibility.
Okay. What's next after credibility?
Transferability. This is the parallel to external validity or generalizability, it asks. To what extent might these findings have applicability in other contexts or settings?
But case studies aren't statistically generalizable, right?
Right. So transferability isn't achieved through sampling, but through thick description. Your job as the researcher is to provide a really rich, detailed, dense description of your case and its context. This allows readers, other researchers, practitioners to judge for themselves whether the findings might be relevant or transferable to their own situations. You provide the information for them to make the transferability judgment.
You give them the basis to decide.
Yeah.
Got it. Third criterion.
Dependability. This is the qualitative equivalent of reliability, it asks. Is the research process stable and consistent? If another researcher were to follow your process, could they logically arrive at similar conclusions, though not necessarily identical ones?
How do you demonstrate dependability?
The key technique here is the audit trail. This means keeping meticulous, transparent documentation of your entire research process, every decision made from research design through data collection to analysis. Your field notes, memos, analysis documentation, and especially your case study protocol all form part of this audit trail. It allows an external reviewer, like an examiner, to follow your steps and logic.
So documenting everything.
Everything. And the 4th criterion is confirmability, which parallels objectivity. It asks, to what degree are the findings grounded in the data itself, rather than being solely the product of the researcher's biases, motivations, or perspectives?
How do you show confirmability?
Again, the audit trail is crucial because it shows the link between the data and the conclusions. But another key technique here is reflexivity. This involves critically examining and reporting on your own role as the researcher, your background, assumptions, potential biases, and how your presence and interactions might have shaped the research process and findings. Demonstrating reflexivity shows you've considered your own influence and strive to ensure conclusions are data-driven.
Credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability. Got it. The guide also highlights some key characteristics specifically of interpretive case studies. What makes them distinct in their approach?
Building on our earlier discussion, interpretive studies have some core hallmarks. First is the primacy of subjective meaning. The central goal is understanding the world from the participant's point of view. As Geertz famously said, interpretive analysis is about understanding constructions of other people's constructions of what's going on.
Getting inside their heads.
In a way, yes. This leads to the emphasis on thick description, which we mentioned under transferability, but is also core to the interpretive goal itself. It's about providing that rich, detailed, nuanced account of social interactions, cultural symbols, and individual meanings, going far beyond just surface-level reporting.
And the researcher's role.
The researcher is acknowledged as the instrument. Unlike positivism's attempt to eliminate researcher influence, interpretivism recognizes that the researcher's subjectivity is an unavoidable and potentially valuable part of the process. You filter the data through your own lens. This, however, absolutely demands reflexivity, that constant critical self-examination of how your own background, assumptions, and interactions are shaping the research.
You have to be aware of your own lens.
Constantly. Then there's the concept of the double hermeneutic, which comes from Anthony Giddens. It's a fascinating idea.
Explain that one again.
It basically means interpretation works in two directions. You, the researcher, are trying to interpret how the people you study make sense of their world. That's the first interpretation, or hermeneutic. But the people you study are also aware they're being studied, and your questions, your presence, your ideas might influence their understanding and how they express it. That's the second interpretation. Research becomes a dialogue, not a one-way observation. Your interpretations and their interpretations shape each other.
That's mind-bending. So research changes the researched.
Potentially, yes, or at least how they articulate their understanding. Finally, generalization in interpretive studies is about insight, not statistical representativeness. The goal isn't usually to say X% of companies do Y. It's to produce rich insights, develop new concepts, like Shoshana Zuboff's concept of informant, which came from case studies, or generate theory that provides a valuable lens for understanding other similar situations. The value lies in the depth of understanding and the theoretical contribution.
Okay, that clarifies the unique nature of interpretive work. So, wrapping up this section on rigor and reporting, what are some of the most common pitfalls that doctoral students, like those in the Advanced Qualitative Research Methods course, absolutely need to avoid when doing case study research?
Based on the guide and general experience, there are a few common traps. First, simply a lack of rigor. This means failing to follow systematic procedures for data collection and analysis, or failing to document those procedures adequately. No audit trail. This leaves your study open to criticism.
Not being systematic.
Right. Second, applying statistical logic inappropriately. Trying to generalize findings from one or a few cases to a large population. Remember, case study generalization is typically analytical, generalizing to theory, not statistical, generalizing to a population.
Using the wrong kind of generalization.
Exactly. Third, producing a confusing narrative. This often happens when the report is just a simple chronology of events. First this happened, then that happened, rather than a properly structured analysis that develops themes or tests propositions using the evidence.
Just storytelling, not analysis.
Yes. Fourth, insufficient data or weak triangulation. Relying too heavily on just one source of data, like only interviews, without seeking corroboration from documents or observations. This makes your findings much less credible.
Not enough cross-checking.
Right. And finally, a subtle but important one. Ignoring or downplaying disconfirming evidence. It's natural to get attached to your emerging ideas or themes, but you have to actively look for data that contradicts or challenges your interpretation. Don't just sweep it under the rug. Addressing conflicting data honestly is actually an opportunity to refine your theory, make it more nuanced, and ultimately produce stronger, more credible research. Don't be afraid of complexity.
Wow, we have certainly covered a huge amount of ground in this deep dive. We've gone from the really fundamental philosophical underpinnings of case study research all the way through the practical steps of design, data collection, analysis, and crucially, ensuring the rigor and trustworthiness of your work.
We really have. And I hope it's clear that case study research, when done well, is an incredibly powerful methodology. It's particularly valuable for you as doctoral students looking to investigate those complex social phenomena as they actually unfold in their natural settings. It's the go-to method for answering those rich how and why questions through that kind of in-depth holistic inquiry.
Absolutely. And a key message from the guide by Professor Boateng and Dr. Barnor, which we've tried to echo, is that a successful case study is absolutely not just an unstructured anecdote or a simple story. It is and must be a rigorous, systematic, and well-documented research process.
That's the core message. The whole journey really starts with that conscious, explicit choice of your philosophical paradigm, whether you lean towards a positivist, interpretive, or critical realist stance. Because, as we discussed, that foundational choice shapes everything else that follows in your study.
Right, it sets the direction. And then building on that foundation, a robust research design is fundamental. That means having a clear, refined research question, a very carefully defined and bounded case or cases, and that detailed case study protocol acting as your roadmap.
And during the execution phase, the deliberate use of multiple sources of data, employing triangulation consistently to cross-check findings, and then engaging in systematic analysis, whether it's thematic analysis or that careful within case, followed by cross-case comparison in multiple case studies. That's how you build those convincing, strongly evidence-based arguments that stand up to scrutiny.
Exactly. And ultimately, the quality, the merit of a case study, particularly for those of you presenting your work for doctoral examination, maybe in the Advanced Qualitative Research Methods course at the University of Ghana Business School, it's judged by its trustworthiness. You need to demonstrate its credibility, its transferability through thick description, its dependability via the audit trail, and its confirmability through reflexivity and data grounding.
If you follow these principles, the ones laid out so clearly in the guide, you absolutely can produce research that is not only methodologically sound and rigorous, but also makes a genuinely significant contribution, whether theoretical or practical, to your field.
So let's quickly reiterate those key takeaways, the absolute must-remembers for your doctoral journey using case studies.
Okay, takeaway number 1.
Your paradigm is your compass. That philosophical stance, it's arguably the most important decision you'll make. It dictates your questions, your methods, what you even count as a valid finding. You absolutely have to be explicit about it in your thesis and justify your choice.
Second, design before you dig. Don't just jump into data collection. A well-thought-out, well-documented research design, including that formal case study protocol, is your absolute best defense against claims that your research lacks rigor. It's your roadmap. Create it carefully.
Third, triangulation is non-negotiable. Seriously, never rely on just one data source, ever. The credibility of your findings skyrockets when an interview account is backed up by evidence from a document and maybe even an observation. Cross-check everything.
Fourth, embrace the iterative process. Remember, case study research often isn't strictly linear. You'll likely move back and forth between collecting data, analyzing it, refining your ideas, maybe going back to collect more data. This flexibility, this dialogue with your data, is actually a strength of the method, not a weakness.
Fifth, think in replications, not samples. If you're doing a multiple case study, remember your goal is analytical generalization to theory, not statistical generalization to a population. You select cases strategically to test and refine your emerging theory, following that replication logic. Each case is a test, not just a data point.
Sixth, the audit trail is your proof of rigor. Document everything meticulously. Keep records of your design choices, your procedures, your analysis steps, your decision-making points. Your methods chapter, backed up by this audit trail, is where you demonstrate the dependability and confirmability, the overall trustworthiness of your research.
And finally, seventh, tell a compelling evidence-based story. Your final report, your thesis, needs to be more than just a dry recitation of findings. It should be a rich, holistic narrative that seamlessly weaves together your theoretical argument with vivid, concrete evidence from your cases. Let the reader see the analysis through the story you tell. Now, to really bring all these concepts home and show them in action, the guide by Professor Boateng and Dr. Barnor includes those fantastic illustrative examples in the appendices, using the Oedipesoap scenario we touched upon.
Yes, those appendices are incredibly valuable. For doctoral students wanting to see exactly how you might write up an exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory case study using that structured format we discussed, appendices A, B, and C provide concrete examples based on Oedipesoap's navigating the COVID-19 crisis.
Right, so Appendix A shows an exploratory case focusing on that initial chaos and uncertainty, trying to understand how Oedipesoap's navigated the very beginning of the pandemic, leading to emergent themes.
Exactly, it sets the stage, exploring the unknown. Appendix B provides a descriptive account, systematically documenting the specific strategies ADIPA implemented across operations, HR, marketing that detailed what happened, picture.
And Appendix C.
Appendix C offers an explanatory case study. It goes beyond description to build that causal argument, linking specific actions like Amaz's adaptive leadership and the digital pivot directly to the company's remarkable 50% revenue growth during the crisis. It tries to explain why they succeeded. Seeing these different approaches applied to the same basic scenario is incredibly instructive.
Definitely sounds like required reading alongside the main guide. So you've just taken a deep dive with us into a doctoral student's guide to case study research, a truly vital resource from Professor Richard Boateng and Dr. Jonathan Barnor of the University of Ghana Business School. We've journeyed through the entire life cycle of case study research, from those deep philosophical roots to the very practical, nuanced art of telling your research story with rigor.
And as you embark on your own doctoral journey again, especially those of you undertaking the Advanced Qualitative Research Methods course, please remember that case study research is a method that truly empowers you. It allows you to unravel those complex, messy, real-world phenomena in their natural context, enabling you to make unique and potentially very impactful contributions to your field.
So here's a final thought to leave you with as you consider your next research steps. In a world that's absolutely brimming with complex challenges and fascinating situations, what bounded system, what specific case, organization, community, or process are you uniquely positioned to explore in depth? What insights might you uncover that could transform our understanding and maybe even our practice?
It's an exciting prospect. We really hope this deep dive has provided you with greater clarity, maybe some new tools, and definitely the confidence to approach your own qualitative research with renewed purpose and rigor.
Keep digging, keep asking those how and why questions, keep discovering, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.